All right.
If the shoe
So
fits.
it's actually an interesting segue to start because we're going to talk about relationships today between husband and wife and occasionally others, which is a problem. So the idea of what is the rule, what is the connection, what are we looking for in that ideal relationship within a home is going to be a big part of our discussion. So we are in Teitzei, and we're going to be looking at chapter 22 today. And we're going to start from 22:13, which if you're looking in your Teitzei Chumashim is page 1118. 1118. 1118. Or 23 or 22:13. Getting good at doing that whole chapter verse thing is much easier for finding your way around, navigating the page numbers. Much more precise. Okay, so Teitzei is the, well, actually, I was going to say smorgasbord of mitzvot, but smorgasbord implies you have some choice of which ones you take. Teitzei is the great holding parasha of many diverse mitzvot. So that's why we are sort of uncharacteristically beginning in the middle of a chapter, because the stuff that comes right before it is not, by most opinions, immediately relevant to what we are about to read. So 22:13, and as my English is already beginning to flag, can I get a volunteer to read? You're looking, hey, excellent.
A man marries a woman and cohabits with her. Then he takes an aversion to her and makes up charges against her and defames her, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her, I found that she was not a virgin. In such a case, the girl's father and mother shall produce the evidence of the girl's virginity before the elders of the town at the gate. And the girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave this man my daughter to wife, but he has taken an aversion to her, so he has made up charges, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But here is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread out the cloth before the elders of the town. The elders of that town shall then take the man and flog him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, for the man has defamed a virgin in Israel. Moreover, she shall remain his wife. He shall never have the right to divorce her.
All right, pause there. What just happened? Apart from the worst honeymoon ever. What happened?
False accusation.
False accusation. What happened before that? They got married.
Yeah.
Right? I know it sounds almost like a throwaway line, but this is one of the places in the Torah where it actually tells us that you need to get married, that forming a relationship between a husband and wife takes an act. It's not just, so you wanna, and then you move in together. That there is a form that where a marriage is constituted. So we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to talk a little bit about when it goes south, when you get this sort of problem. So what's the underlying challenge here? Oh, Nikki?
No, just a quick, is it the yikach?
Yes.
Is that the word for marriage?
Oh, isn't that a great question, right? So the word is, in the Hebrew, the word is yikach, which literally means, anyone know? Take. But take is that wonderful English word that means lots of different things, and it means lots of other things in Hebrew. So it's not a one-to-one translation, which is why the JPS translation translated take in this sentence to mean marry, because to take a wife is the expression within Hebrew to mean to formally establish. Well, possess again has a certain connotation in English, but to formally establish the relationship. And that word formally is going to be the important part. That there's a difference between sleeping with someone and actually taking that person as a wife. And that's something that comes up again and again throughout many of the other stories, most famously with the question of Abraham and Hagar. with what was his relationship with her. Did he take her for a wife? Was she just a concubine? So this is a formal act. Whenever you see the phrase "take so and so for a wife," it doesn't just mean they went home together. It means there was something that established the formal relationship between them, and that's why that came first, and then the cohabitation, and then the actual consummation of the relationship, and then he took an aversion to her.
How long was the timeline? Is there any indication? Sounds like bang, 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 it happened very quickly.
Interesting sound effects.
Okay.
Yeah. Bada bing, bada boom. Yeah.
I didn't mean that.
Right.
No.
And he's blushing, God bless him. We're just gonna make it worse, that's all. You make it so easy for us.
Never mind.
So the question is, how much time has to happen here?
Yeah, because they're still wondering whether she's a virgin, so it must have happened quickly after the marriage and the consummation.
Exactly. So
And he's
the
saying, I changed my mind, I don't like this woman.
right. So the aversion side, which we're going to talk about translation. Remind me in just a second on that too. Seems to be happening more or less immediately after the act of consummation, and then he uses the one grounds that he can find for raising an objection that is beneficial to him. Now, why would raising this as an issue be uniquely beneficial to him as opposed to just saying, I don't like her, I want a divorce?
Probably wouldn't owe her any right.
Okay, well, ketubah, right? So everybody remembers how the ketubah system works, right? When you get married, the man presents his wife with a document, a contract, a prenuptial agreement in the modern lingo, that says if we get divorced, meaning if I divorce you, or if by just cause the court forces me to divorce you, I will pay you X amount. And although they are now rendered as a formula and really a token amount compared to what modern judicial systems do, in the ancient world, those were negotiated. Right? So if you married a woman and she asked for a huge ketubah, you would be on the hook for a massive payout if you had to or wanted to divorce her, unless the marriage was rendered under false pretenses or it was proven that she had been unfaithful, in which case you're free and clear. You don't have to pay a dime, not a single shekel. So he is trying to find a way to get himself off the hook for having to pay for a divorce to a woman that he now has an aversion. The literal word is not actually aversion, it's hate, right? That he comes to hate.
Two things bother me. One, you kind of answered. To me, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. This woman has to live with this man.
Okay.
Ever, they can't get divorced. Who is being punished? The man or the woman?
Okay.
And one other thing.
Okay.
The bridal cloth.
You mean
How
the
many people
you mean the proof
keep
of
the
virginity?
proof of virginity?
Yes.
How many people keep that stain? Was that a normal
Yes.
thing?
For
to
exactly
keep?
this reason.
Okay.
For exactly this
That
reason.
I wasn't sure of.
Right. Remember, there was no paternity test in the ancient world.
Right.
There was no way to establish the paternity of a child, which meant if there was cause to believe that the woman had already had relations prior to the marriage, in addition to if it had been if it had been post-betrothal, in which case it was already adulterous, but even if it was pre-betrothal, if you weren't 100% sure that she hadn't been with someone else, then the first child born to you, you would not be 100% sure was your child.
Yeah.
And that child would then be inheriting your family's estates, your property, even though they weren't actually your kid. And that was considered a big deal. It is still, I think, psychologically considered a big deal in the modern world, even though our estates are handled in many other ways. And even though we have tests to establish, without a shadow of a doubt, who was the father or not. So her lack of virginity having been established, he does have a real justifiable cause against her, And it puts her either in the case of this was false when you said she was a virgin, or if it was after betrothal, she committed adultery, in which case she's going to be executed. So this is a huge accusation, and to prevent such an accusation, families absolutely would keep the proof of the virginity in order to say, you can't make such claims against our daughter because we got proof. Michael, very patient.
Provenance and chain of evidence.
Provenance and chain of evidence, yes.
How do they establish that for this law?
No, it was given to the family as what was handed over to them after the wedding night. Now, that is part of the problem here. I mean, from the as far as the evidence goes on the groom's behalf, because they have proof, right? They have something that proves that it happened, and if it hadn't happened, then the groom should have complained before handing that over to the family, right? So he already, at some point after the consummation of the wedding, at some point he allowed this cloth, which proved her status, to be taken from the bridal chamber and given to her family. So that really puts him in a very bad light, that he is definitely crying foul when it's not foul, and it's because of ulterior motives. Now, proving that she actually was involves witnesses to her infidelity or her, we'll call it licentiousness.
I was thinking more of the proving that cloth is actually the one that came from the bridal chamber
and was stained in the way that would normally have been stained had the status been what was claimed.
So do witnesses come to the bridal chamber and watch the cloth being removed?
Ish.
I'm sorry.
Ish. It was slightly more public than we currently think. Yep. It was slightly more public than we currently think, in the sense that you didn't just have your party and then all the guests left and then you went upstairs. The party was still going, and you were escorted to the chamber by the guests. And you would often have been prepared or somehow otherwise made ready for this new stage in your life. And yes, then after you were finished, you would not have exited without other people knowing that you were then going, to breakfast or whatever it was. And then everything else would be able to be attested. It was not exactly like you were imprisoned, but there was definitely public note of your comings and goings. So yes, a bit different than going to the Hilton for your honeymoon.
Are there still countries in the Middle East that
Yes.
do this?
There are cultures around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, we are not the only culture that has had this, and there are still cultures that make this a very important point.
Royalty
Right.
went on for many, many years.
For the exact reason that I said before, of if you can't establish the paternity of a child, and if paternity is important for either inheritance or royal lineage, then you need to be sure that she is a blank slate, to be blunt. And that's why this was such a big deal for the family to approve, and it's also why it was such a big deal for him to accuse her of having violated that. Make sense? Okay, and okay, now come to the punishment.
Second question.
Okay. So let's come back to the punishment. So he gets flogged because he's lying about this. She is not trapped with him. It's not the way the Torah looks at it. She is now his perpetual dependent. He is forced forever to take care of her.
Yes.
That is the intent. Because think of what would be the backup scenario, right? So the backup scenario is, I lied about her. I tried to get her in trouble so I wouldn't have to pay. But all right, you found out, whip, whip, I've been flogged. Okay, now I want to divorce her, right? And I want to leave her for her penniless, but her reputation has already got this gossipy stain to it. And, will her ketubah really be able to support her after this? Better that he should be forced to be paying for her upkeep and her life forever without any chance of stopping that.
But she can't remarry or find, it's just.
And that's going to come back to one of our questions when we look at our commentary, what was the purpose of the marriage? Was the purpose of the marriage for him and her to have, lovey-dovey romance for the rest of their life, or was it to provide economic security for both of them and a future generation?
Yeah, what about the children? You're supposed to, she can't produce children now.
Who says she can't produce children?
Well, can she marry somebody else?
No, from him.
No, from
He
him.
has a
Can you
con-
imagine?
yeah.
He has a
Yeah.
conjugal
You
obligation.
know, can you
Well, I think
imagine?
he wants nothing more to do with her.
And she
Well,
would
but-
want nothing more to
well,
do with him.
So her feelings do come into consideration, but his not so much. A husband is considered by Jewish law to have conjugal obligations to all of his wives if he has more than one. He's not allowed to say, I love your cooking, but I like her in the bedroom. No. He can make whatever he wants to do about the cooking, but he has to feed them, clothe them, and be intimate with them, as is customary by Jewish law. And yes, she does have some say in that of not tonight, dear. But it was considered not just intimacy for romance, it was also intimacy for procreation. It is in her best interest to have children that will look after her in her old age. So whether she wants to be with him or not, whether he wants to be with her or not, we already know he doesn't, they may still need to work together to accomplish something that is beneficial for both of them. And yes, that would be an extremely unpleasant and awkward moment of intimacy. But the alternatives were considered worse in the ancient world, especially for her. Especially for her, to have been either cast out if his accusation was allowed to stand just because I say so, or if she were cast out as a divorcee, she also would have reduced prospects because of everything that had happened. So this way she was guaranteed that she would always be taken care of and have a chance to have at least part of her life be okay, even though this part has obviously been broken in a very bad way.
But is she required to live in the same house?
He is required to provide for her. If he can provide additional residence and prefers that, then he could. But if they have no choice but to share a home, then they share a home. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some commentary because got my clock up there. I'm losing track of time. Have to get a new battery. What was that?
I said, obviously, it's not a situation we're really, that we are very familiar with.
No, nor comfortable with. I mean, this is making the best in terms of the punishment side, making the best of a horrible situation. But the question is that I want to focus on for us is, well, what was the ideal situation then, right? What was the actual hope for young people or old people getting married? Was it really just mechanistic? You're taking a wife and this is a bargaining, haggle kind of arrangement, and you're going to work together to produce children and to produce an heir and to have economic support for each other, and anything else, well, who cares about that? Or was it supposed to be, you know, the romantic love and all of that? So we're going to look at weddings, marriages. What were the expectations? So top of our text, this precept. Do you mind still reading?
Sure.
Thanks.
This precept, to take a wife according to the laws of halakha, applies in every place and every time. If someone transgresses this and takes a woman to wife without consecrating her first, he disobeys this positive precept.
All right. So what does it mean to consecrate her first before taking? So this is what's known as kiddushin in the wedding ceremony. And there are three ways that you can do kiddushin in Jewish law, only one of which we actually use nowadays. The first is with sex, with, I'm using the term money loosely, and a document. Right? These are ors. Right? It's not all three. So with sex, you have to specifically say, by this act of intercourse, you will be betrothed to me. You are now married to me. And the woman has to assent and go along with this. With money, the man has to say, by this gift, by this object that I give to you, you are consecrated to me. You are betrothed to me. If that sounds at all familiar, that's because that is the formula that we still use. We just use the word ring as the object that is being used to symbolize this consecration. Document is not a ketubah. A document would be writing a document that says, if you accept this document, you are married to me, which is not what a ketubah says. A ketubah says, we're getting married, and if things have a bad outcome, this is the consequence. This document doesn't say that. It just says, piece of paper. If you take this document, we're married.
But is this betrothal or the marriage? There's two parts to the wedding ceremony.
And we're going to get to the second part. This is what is known as betrothal in Jewish law, kiddushin, the consecration, which is a bad word in English, the betrothal, because Americans tend to think of betrothal as the engagement party. And that's, if you get engaged and you break up, does anyone need to get a divorce? No. If you get engaged and one person cheats on, somebody against their fiance, is that adultery? No, I mean, it's unfaithfulness, and you'd expect there to be rather massive repercussions in the relationship, but it's not technically considered adultery.
Adultery is only with a married woman.
Which in Jewish law happens at this point, right? So in Judaism, if you give somebody a ring and say, will you marry me? And she says yes, and you say, great, in 6 months we're going to have the chuppah and everything and the rabbi and all of that, you're not betrothed under Jewish law. I don't care what English says. In Jewish law, you're not betrothed. You're not betrothed until you take out the ring and you say, behold, you are consecrated to me by this ring according to the laws of Moses in Israel.
So it's semantics.
That is the betrothal. That is the consecration. That is the engagement. And it happens right then and there. And then by the time 20, 25 minutes more are gone, you have finished the process and now you're 100% married. In the ancient world, the ring ceremony and the finalization of the marriage could be up to a year apart. Right? They didn't have both of those happen at the same time on the same day in the same place. They would be the arrangement, the consecration, the giving of the gift, the accepting of the gift, and then you'd go off and plan the party and get the house ready and get everything that you were needed in order to have an actual family life. And then you'd throw the big party as you brought the couple together and everything happened consummation-wise, and now they were living together forever. But in the meantime, they weren't living together. That's where adultery while betrothed could creep in under Jewish law. We found that separating those two events, not such a good idea overall. That's why we do them now together in one ceremony. But technically, they are two parts of, or two separate parts to the wedding process. There's the betrothal, and then there's the actual finalization of the marriage, which happens with the Shefa Brachot, the 7 blessings. How are we doing? Maybe? Okay. So if you just take someone and say, hey, baby, you, me, forever, right? That is violating a negative precept. That is, you are breaking one of the commandments by not getting married according to Jewish law. Make sense? Okay. Onward.
Now the sages obligated us that the bridegroom is to say a benediction over this mitzvah, or another is to say it in his behalf, whereupon he answers Amen, in the way that benedictions are said over all religious acts. For we have a standing rule about benedictions over religious deeds. Even if one has acquitted himself of his obligation, he may acquit another. The form of the benediction is so.
Pause. All right, so it's a mitzvah. There's a blessing for it. So it's not just enough of, hey, here's my ring. There has to be a blessing that goes along with it. And those of you who have been to Jewish weddings, I don't know whether you ever got the translation, but this is what the blessing that comes with the giving of the ring actually says.
Praised are you, Lord our God, King of the world, who hallowed us with his commandments and separated us from forbidden relations, forbade us those betrothed and permitted us those married by the right of the chuppah and consecration. Praised are you, Lord, who hallows his people Israel by the right of the chuppah and consecration.
Make sense? Sound familiar? Chuppah u'kiddushin, right? That's how we do weddings. And we're thanking God for giving us this commandment to do weddings like this rather than just eloping, I guess would be an alternative. And this says that there are some relations which we don't do, brother, sister, not a good idea. And there are other relations we can do if we do them according to this way. And that seems to be perfectly fine. Make sense?
What does forbetus those betrothed?
It means I can't marry someone else who's already married.
Okay, but so betrothed, I thought, that's not engagement, that's.
Well, sorry, I can't, this particular, forbade us those betrothed, that phrase, right. So that's saying, this is, how delicate to put it. This is a reminder to the groom that although you are now betrothed, you have all the obligations of being married and none of the privileges, right? So during this betrothed period, no hanky-panky. But once you're finished with the chuppah, then hanky-panky away. So that creates this time in between the betrothal and the actual consummation that can be very awkward. And another reason why we condense the ceremony so that the betrothal lasts all of about 20 minutes.
And this applies only to the woman, just to that.
Well, the man certainly might engage in activities with other women that are assuming not married and not be considered as committing adultery. His betrothed, however, may have made certain stipulations regarding whether or not he's allowed to engage in those acts, and if so, whether or not that would nullify their agreement. Mm-hmm. So it's not as cut and dry as just he can do whatever he wants. There are still ramifications to his behavior. Okay, from this blessing, marriage, financial transaction, social construct, or romantic love? Or can't you tell from what we've just said? Does it say anything about romance?
Romance doesn't enter the picture.
Doesn't say anything about romance. Does it say this is a financial situation, an economic bargain? No. It says God gave us commandments. Those commandments make us holy. Those commandments say we can have some relations and some we can't. Thank God. That's all we've said. Okay, so right now we've got a very neutral blessing as regards to the relationship, although we are still making a very positive statement about us and God and living our life accordingly.
So at this point, the bride and groom really didn't have much to say about this.
Well, he had his phrase to say, here's your ring.
I mean about their getting together. This was an arrangement that the families made.
It could be, right? So the betrothal, and indeed this could sometimes happen, that a betrothal ceremony could happen when both bride and groom were minors. Now, again, remember, they're not actually married. They are now just bound to one another. When they reach the age of majority, they are allowed to say, the arrangement our parents made is not the arrangement I want to go through with, and cancel the arrangement. But until they're that majority, they are considered to be spoken for at that point. So the arrangements could be made, but they couldn't be finalized without the consent of the two. Well, yeah. Well, it was complicated because it was more than just, do you love me? Regardless of what they say in Fiddler on the Roof. Do you love me? Right? There was more than that. There was so much more of the family, the community, the economic needs, all these other things wrapped together that often the family almost needed to help set up the process for the next family to begin. And you would do that with plenty of planning in order to make sure it was successful. And then you sort of assume the kids would grow up and agree with whatever you had already planned. And if they didn't, they were certainly permitted to not. But by and large, most did. Most kids, when they grew up, went along with whatever their parents had arranged. Okay, let's continue a little bit.
This is the form of the benediction over betrothal, which it is the custom to recite in our land. It is of practice to arrange it to be said over a cup filled with wine and to recite it after the act of consecration.
All right, bold and italics, the rabbi's trying to tell you something in the handout. What's unusual about the order that we do this, right? The man presents the ring, the woman accepts it with the formula that he uses, behold, you are consecrated to me, and then we do the blessing. Why is that weird?
Normally, we do a blessing first.
Exactly right. For almost everything else, there are a couple of really unusual examples. This is perhaps one of the most regular weird examples. We do blessing first and then act. That's the whole point of having mindfulness of what I am about to do, of elevating the act that I am about to do as a religious act, and then I do the act, right? Thought, act, thought, act. That's the order of things, or should be. Here we have act, and then the blessing. That seems weird. Why is that? Keep reading.
It was said a reason for this, that because the act of consecration depends on the mind of another, meaning the woman, it is not proper to recite the benediction before the religious act, as with other religious deeds.
Right, so picture, for example, the guy is standing there with the ring. He says the blessing, and then he says, "Behold, you are consecrated to me." And she goes, "I changed my mind." He just wasted a blessing. And a bracha levatala, a blessing that was said in vain, is considered a big deal in Judaism. We don't go around using God's name and using blessings unless it is going to happen. It's why you don't just, hum, blessings to yourself quietly while you walk down the street, but say them with intentionality before the act. It's why before you eat something, you think, what blessing am I going to say for this carrot, for this apple, for this cheese, before you start the Baruch Atah. Because if you say the wrong blessing, you've done something wrong. It's not just, oops, I made a mistake. It was, I have used God's name in a way that was inappropriate. So there were concerns that if you say the blessing first and then she suddenly takes her hand away and says no, then you just wasted the blessing. So better to make sure that she agrees by having the ring on and then say the blessing as a celebration of what just occurred. But that flips the normal order. Make sense? Okay. However,
Rabbi Moses ben Maimon,
also known as Rambam,
of blessed memory, wrote that if one consecrated a woman as his wife and did not say the benediction before, as with other benedictions, he is not to say the benediction afterward, for it will be a blessing in vain.
Not the custom that we follow, but Rambam was very worried that you should say the blessing first and then do the ring, because more than likely she was going to say yes. And definitely if you said the blessing after you'd given the ring, well, you weren't going to give another ring to someone else. So that blessing was left hanging without an action to follow it. So he thought it was better to say the blessing before rather than after. We have a different interpretation. Okay, let's get back to our main question, though, of what's happening here with this whole aversion stuff.
A man marries a woman and cohabits with her. Then he takes an aversion to her. The Hebrew refers merely to a man who takes a woman, but the implication is that she is legally engaged to him.
Right, the betrothal, right, what we were talking about up here, kiddushin.
The situation being described here is that when eventually they are married and he first sleeps with her, he takes an aversion to her because she does not please him sexually.
Ramban, who's writing this, is taking that off the order of the verbs, right? He wasn't upset with her when he originally betrothed her. He wasn't upset with her enough to eventually get together. It was right after the consummation that all of a sudden now he's a hater. So there must have been something happening during that intimate period that is what made him so upset.
He gets up in the morning, goes to court, and announces that he found her not to be a virgin. His intention is to divorce her without having to pay the amount specified in the ketubah. She became engaged to him under the presumption that she was a virgin, and his claim is that she must have committed adultery since their engagement. The situation where the charge proves true will be discussed later.
So if you continue reading in the Torah, it does go on to talk about, well, what happens actually if he was right, and it wasn't just that he was being a jerk. But what Ramban is trying to tell us here is that, as we talked about before, he's doing this in order to get out of paying the ketubah. Well, why? What's his beef?
He just wasn't pleased.
He just wasn't pleased.
Yeah.
Exactly. So marriage, financial, social, romantic.
Neither.
I mean, by this commentary, by this commentary.
There must be something romantic involved if he wants to get rid of her just because he's not 100% happy.
So he wanted somebody who would make him happy. She didn't. And therefore, end of story, sayonara. And now he's just trying to get out of the penalty payment. But if you really loved someone, but they weren't exactly your pleasure queen,
How could you expect her to be if you're getting a virgin who has no experience? Where did he think the experience, what the pleasure was going to come from?
a very good question. A very good.
Experiences you teach her.
And do we assume then that every concubine that was taken by other people in the ancient world were loved because they had that skill?
Many were.
Many were, but also many
Also
weren't, but
many
were
weren't.
only used for the physical skill that they
Right,
provided.
that's what they were there for.
The same way a maid would be used for the cleaning, and a cook would be used for the cooking, a concubine would be used for the other stuff. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he was hoping for the great romantic moment on the honeymoon and was disappointed by her lack of skills, which he had no business knowing because of where she came from. It could just be, hey, you know what? I bought you to warm my bed and you don't light my fire. So get out. It could still be a very mechanical, mercantile exchange that he doesn't feel that he got what he paid for when it came to the intimacy side, which was part of what the bargain was, not part of what the romance was. So it really could be either still at this point. Let's see if we can't tighten it up a little bit. Well, first of all, we got to make sure that everybody knows what the guy's doing is wrong. So we bring the famous Rashi.
One transgression leads to another.
That is to say, if you commit one sin, you will end up committing more sins in its wake.
When he hates her, also translated as takes an aversion, he violates the commandment, you shall not hate your brother in your heart.
All right, let's make sure we get that. The sin that he has committed here is hate. We are not supposed to hate our brother in our heart. And note very poignantly, Rashi is interpreting not hating your brother in your heart to also mean women. You're just not allowed to hate other people. And because he has already broken that commandment, because he has let hate come into him and is treating her now out of hate, what other commandment does he end up breaking?
That inevitably brings him to the sin of harmful speech, making up slander.
Right? So because he has allowed hate to take up residence, it has now inspired him to another transgression, which is Lashon Hara, which is Motzi Shem Ra, to slander a person's name, to give them a bad reputation. So he's wrong. and our sages and our tradition very much condemn what he's trying to do here and say this is not good behavior. But we still haven't established, is this romance, is this just business, what's going on here? Well, that's because we haven't talked yet about the end of the wedding process, right? The beginning of it sounds very contractual and it's very business. And like we said, many times it was handled by the previous generation, the parents, to be arranged as the most opportune ways for everything, da 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 da. But the end, when you are under the chuppah, when you are together and it is being finalized, is marked by 7 blessings, what we call the Sheva Brachot. And that's what 1 through 7 on the back page here is. So, Judy, if you could read 1 through 7, I may interrupt you from time to time, but I want you to think, is this describing a business or a romantic activity? Make sense? Keep going.
Praised are you, Lord our God, who rules the universe, for creating the fruit of the vine.
That Bray Priagafen, that's pretty generic. We do that all the time, although generally when we're doing something happy, we like to bring the wine out. Keep going.
Praised are you, Lord our God, who rules the universe, whose glory is evident in all of creation.
Nice statement. Doesn't really answer our question yet.
Praised are you, Lord our God, who rules the universe, creator of man and woman.
I apologize for the additional capitalization. That was not intentional. That is a typo on my finger, hitting the shift key for some unknown reason. But again, we haven't necessarily said anything yet, but we are acknowledging that God is the creator of man and woman. It's kind of an interesting phrase. Keep going.
Praised are you, Lord our God, who rules the universe, who created male and female in the divine image, that together they might perpetuate life.
All right, so is this Where does this fall on our question? Is this celebrating romantic? Is this celebrating that we have a species to look forward to? Is this biology, or is this psychology? Or can't tell?
Strict biology.
Strict biology? You know what?
Absolutely.
It's good that our species doesn't die out.
Right.
But why point out that both were made in the divine image? And why point out that both were made? I mean, it would have been a lot simpler if we just were like amoebas. And whenever we needed another generation, we just split down the middle and, you know, we had two of us. Right? No wedding parties to worry about, no guest lists and all of that stuff. It's just, you know, and you're two people and now you can go on. I don't know. There may be some hints here that there is something special about coming together with another person that is being reflected in this whole marriage thing. Let's keep going. Keep digging. We're on 5.
Thank you. Praised are you, Lord, creator of man and woman.
Man, we're beating that theme in.
May Zion rejoice as her children return to her in joy. Praised are you, Lord, who causes Zion to rejoice in her children.
All right, now don't jump up and down yet and say we found romance, because we might have to modify the metaphor of Zion. What is Zion?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, the land of Israel, right? Our homeland. And we want the idea of her children to come home, meaning for the restoration of our people in the land of Israel. That is what makes mom happy. That's what makes Zion happy, is for her kids to be happy. And so the phrase here is, we want our kids to be happy, and the best way for them to be happy would be for Israel to be restored. But this may be a second best. That is to say, the wedding may be as good as we can get until the restoration of the land. Remember, for most of our history, when we've said these blessings under the chuppah, Israel was not a country that was alive and thriving in the Middle East. It was always under foreign occupation, and usually life there was extremely hard and bitter. So the wedding seems to be held up as kind of this is our best joy we get now until Zion itself is restored. And then that will be an even bigger joy. But in the meantime, this is number 2 on the joy list. Fairly powerful statement to say the second most happy thing in all of existence is this. Only beneath the restoration of Zion, which is used also as a metaphor for the redemption of the world. So the world may not be redeemed, but at least I'm getting married. Maybe moving a little bit away from that whole business transaction idea. Maybe. Keep going.
Grant perfect joy to these loving companions, as you did for the first man and woman in the Garden of Eden. Praised are you, Lord, who creates the joy of bride and groom.
Anybody unclear now? We've gotten completely away from the idea that this is business. That the goal for these two people getting married is not go procreate, make sure there's a secure inheritance, provide for your old age by having children to support you. The goal for these two young people is joy, happiness. And we are happy that God created us in a way that this would be a vehicle for our happiness. Right? As the French would say, vive le différent. Right? It's
almost even higher, because that's before sin came into the world. So that's almost perfectionism.
In Gan Eden, but so it's important to remember that according to the Jewish reading of the book of Genesis, intimacy between Adam and Eve occurred before the fall, before we were expelled from the garden. They had already been intimate with one another. They hadn't given birth to anyone, but they had been intimate. So that whole joy metaphor is both the spiritual joy of being with your perfect partner and the physical joy of being with your partner, all wrapped together, and being thankful that God created a vehicle for this to happen, because we could have been an amoeba, for crying out loud, and how much fun is that? But instead, we got this. Wow, what a gift. Despite the fact as we see in the Torah, that sometimes it goes horribly, horribly wrong. The gift is that this should be going wonderfully, wonderfully right. And then the seventh one, which should remove all doubt.
Praised are you, Lord our God, who rules the universe, who created joy and gladness, bride and groom, pleasure, song, delight, laughter, love and harmony, peace and companionship.
How's that for a list? Right? That God created all of these feelings, all of these things as potential in the world through our marriages. And that is just an amazing gift. Right? It's like the feeling of saying, thank God I can actually feel full. Thank God I can taste good food. Did you ever think about that? Why in the world did God bother giving us taste buds that could appreciate good food? Who cares? It's just fuel, right? It just keeps my body moving so I can keep going on till tomorrow. So why should I need to be equipped to be able to appreciate good food versus not so good food? I mean, sure, make sure I'm not eating poison and rotten stuff, but the difference between mediocre and superb, why should I be able to differentiate? And yet we can. Why should I care about being able to appreciate the beauty of a forest? I don't need to know that a forest is beautiful. I just need to know if there are any tigers in it. And yet we can see beauty. Why should I need to be able to have a feeling of companionship, of love, of harmony, of peace with my spouse? I just need to be able to procreate and protect the inheritance and provide for my future. And yet God gave us the gift to have all of these other bonuses that have no functional purpose in our life. Now, they are incredibly important purposes, but we could have lived and done everything we needed to do without them. And yet God chose to give us the capacity for these as well. It's kind of amazing. Keep going.
Lord our God, may there always be heard in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem voices of joy and gladness, of happiness, voices of bride and groom, the jubilant voices of those joined in marriage under the chuppah, the voices of young people feasting and singing. Praised are you, Lord, who causes the groom and the bride to rejoice together.
All right. If you look very, very carefully at the last line of 7 and the last line of 6, the praised are you phrase, what's different between them? They're both talking about joy.
Joys together.
Joy together versus
Joy.
just joy?
Separately, presumably.
Separately, right? That there is a special joy that the bride will feel. There is a special joy the groom will feel. And the final blessing is there is a specialer joy that they will achieve together. That's the goal, is that feeling of joy that comes from the togetherness. That is
significance to the order of presentation. It says bride and groom in 6 and groom and bride. So
that's the translator's attempt to balance things out. It is not reversed in the original Hebrew. In the original Hebrew, the groom is listed first in both phrases. Good question. Yeah. Actually, I didn't even catch that when I was because I borrowed the translation from the rabbi's manual because it was easier than rewriting my own. And I didn't even notice that they had done that when I was putting it together.
Rabbi,
Yes.
these are many of them arranged marriages.
Yes.
Where the groom may have seen the bride from afar, but the bride rarely, if ever, knows.
Depending upon the culture at the time.
Right.
Yes.
But at that time, so when they are betrothed and then consecrating the marriage.
Right.
There's still this unknown feeling.
Absolutely.
They may feel, each one may feel joy that this is occurring.
Right. But they
The
haven't.
togetherness to me seems that it might come further down the road.
But it has to be held up as the goal.
Okay,
And that's what this blessing is saying,
that's the goal.
right? Is that, yes, maybe she's happy to be getting married because, phew, she got married, and it's just a relief in the ancient world. And maybe he's happy to be getting married because now he can begin to have a family and all of that, and he needs someone to do that with. So, phew, anybody would have been fine, but at least I'm married. And eventually, the goal is they will be happy together. that their happiness will be linked. It won't be just separate within the same building, the same bubble of life, but will actually be interdependent and intermingled. That one's joy will be the other's joy and vice versa. And that is for both of them. That they are both expected to have their own joy, and they are both expected to have a joy that comes from together. It's not that one is dominant or one's joy is more important than the other one's. And that comes back to the final midrash that we have here, that's quoted in Ketubot in the Talmud, about how we got made this way in the first place.
All parties concur that there was a single act of creation for both Adam and Eve.
All right, so make sure that that comes clear, because it's not 100% clear in the English like it is in the original, which is God made one first creature, Adam, Eve. That God did not make Adam and then later make Eve. And I know that's how it is always done in the cartoon versions and the children's Bible and all the stories and all of that. That is not the traditional Jewish way of understanding how God made man and woman. They were made together in one act. They were made together in one act. Go on with the explanation, then we'll come back and fill in more.
As Rav Judah said, it is written, and God created Adam in his image.
Which sounds like he created Adam first and in a special way.
And further, male and female, he created them.
Which sounds like they got made with one act. So,
how are the two to be reconciled? To begin with, God contemplated forming them as two, but in the end, one was created.
So the idea here is that there were choices. God could have made us as two totally separate, independent beings. And that could have worked. But instead, God, in the end, made us as being one being, who then was divided and seeks the other being over and over to try and reunite themselves with that other piece. And that was the version that God stuck with. God had options. And we could have been totally and utterly independent from anyone else in life. But instead, we got made as one that then spends a lot of time finding that other piece that fits into their life. And that's good. And that's what the Sheva Brachot, the 7 blessings, are trying to tell us, is that it's better that we are in this position where we are constantly seeking this togetherness, that we are coming back together, finding that joy that only can be made together. And that may not always be easy, and sometimes it goes horribly wrong, like we saw in the Torah reading that we worked on. But it is so much better than just being mechanical, biological beings that just worry about procreating and taking care of business. And for that, we always say, thank God. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Where did we get the story that we are told from the time we start studying that God took a rib from Adam to make Eve?
Well, it never says rib. It says he takes a apart from her, apart from Adam to make Eve. That story is in chapter 2 of Genesis, but it's used as a metaphor for understanding the link between the two of them, not the idea that one of them predates the other in any significant way. At least that's the Jewish reading of that chapter, because you are forced, as you can see, the Talmud had to reconcile. You have a story on the surface which seems to indicate Adam first and Eve second, but you also have verses that seem to indicate simultaneous creation. And so this is the reconciliation that Judaism has come to. And like God, we have choices. When we're trying to reconcile a text, we want to reconcile it not just with its own internal logic, but with the logic of the rest of Torah. And our sages have felt that the best way to understand it was to imagine both as being made simultaneously rather than sequentially. Other commentators, especially from other faiths, look at it differently. But that's their choice to look at it differently. We found that the evidence, in our opinion, weighed more towards saying man and woman together are as one. And that's the starting point. And then other things have to be explained once that's the given. And that was our choice. But like I said, I think our evidence is pretty strong. All right. Thank you very much. Keep studying. See you on Shabbat. We have a wonderful bar mitzvah this week. Well, it's always wonderful, but this week we have a bar mitzvah. It will be wonderful.